Hello, and welcome to video 4 of our series of videos about transformation, or how we can create transformation, as I call it, in our life. We can describe this in several ways. We can look at it about how can we create change in our life, how can we create improvement in the quality of our life. I usually look at this as we start from the idea of if we've got something going on in our life that we don't really like, what can we do about it? So this is all about how we get started into this discussion, this understanding of some principles involved that I've developed over a period of around 30 years of working with these patterns, I call them. We can call them unwanted subconscious patterns if we want. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about at this point. I had spent a little time in the last video, probably a lot of time, and pretty much a rant about why should you sit and watch these videos. I'm not sure if I answered that. I guess if you're here for another one, then maybe we accomplished something there. So again, just to introduce a little bit, I'm Gary. I'm not a professional actor or speaker, as you can tell. I'm just a guy that had some difficulties in life, some challenges, we might say, many years ago, and had a lot of frustration about the materials that were offered at that time. Did not really seem to provide any effective results. So I set out on a quest to find answers, find solutions, and I explored a wide variety of many different subjects. And at this point, I don't recall if we've talked about this or not in the earlier videos. I was trying to not get into too much of my background, but just to give you an idea, I basically set out to to find answers, and it turned into a quest that has lasted most of my life since then, and it's been about 30 years. This all began around the end of the 80s and early 90s. I started off reading a lot of self-help books. There were a few materials that had just come out. Tony Robbins had just come out with, he was still new at that point. There were a few folks like Wayne Dyer and some other materials. So I tried some of the standard books that were out available at that time, things like Power of Positive Thinking, How to Win Friends and Influence Neighbors, or whatever that is, and a few other things along that line. I found it was a total waste of time. Did not provide anything whatsoever as far as making any kind of significant difference in my life. So you may be, hopefully you may be identifying or relating with some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So I may mention some of the struggles involved just so that you can get a sense of relating with that. Because if you are one of the people whose life is good, happens to in a way that when you choose to do something or you want to have you intend for something to happen, it just does. There are apparently a few people in the world that are like that as they choose things, that's what happens. That was not my experience of life. In fact, it was basically the opposite of that. It was very frustrating. So I always hated the things of the typical things that are recommended, things like, set up your goals and set up the steps for your goals, and because that was a recipe for, failure for me in my life. So I'm not sure why I went off into that. I did want to comment, though, that sorry, these are not professionally produced recordings. As we can see, I'm in our spare room and recording this on my phone. So I've had some challenges with the quality of the recording. I haven't been happy with the sound, so I am sorry about the sound quality. I actually ordered a microphone to use and have tried that a little bit. I believe on the last video I was trying to use that, but I've just about come to the conclusion now that the mic is not working. It didn't seem to make any difference in the quality of the sound, so I am sorry. But it is what it is. We will keep trying to improve the quality of our recordings. And I'm looking at reflections in the image. Sorry. Okay, so what we've talked about is we started off talking about some of the things like what affects the quality of our life, and we talked a little bit about how some of these things are influenced, how we as humans, this all begins early in life, during early childhood, and we are observing and interpreting things, and we're forming our views and ideas and perceptions, and those get installed in our shall we say, our internal operating system that we'll call the subconscious. I had originally thought that for this video that I really wanted to get into a discussion about the subconscious, which was one of the subjects that I found myself involved in during this quest. I was going to mention some of the subjects. So I started off with a lot of self-help books. I did get interested in the inner child work of John Bradshaw, which is, I spent a lot of time, I believe, on the second video talking about that. But I also got involved in metaphysics. I've got involved in reading a lot of different materials involving in metaphysics. I've gotten involved in philosophy, Eastern philosophy. Got involved in hypnotism, self-hypnosis. I got involved in the subconscious. Got involved in what's called energy work of the subtle energies. You may have heard of Reiki. Got involved with that for a while. And to jump a little bit more toward the chase of where we're going with all this, I began to understand some principles, and basically I kind of stumbled into a little bit of a process that involved self-hypnosis and working with inner child work. And I kind of began developing a procedure, a process that was like, I call it a meditation. It's like a very deep trance state self-meditation. And working with the inner child and working with memories of the early period of time of childhood. And working with those principles, I started actually getting results. And it worked. And some of the issues that I had, I mean, I had gone to counseling, had some unflattering labels from the psychologists. Was basically told I was a hopeless case. So there you go. But I feel much better now, as a character on some TV show used to say. Anyway, so the interesting thing is I actually started working with this stuff and put together the basics of a process, and it started working. And then I continued to study these various subjects that were involved and basically began to understand what was actually happening, what was going on. And so I over a period of time, I've refined this process so that it implements many many principles from many different sources. And along the way, I would find certain bits and pieces of things that seemed to fit with what was going on and what worked in one area, and I would kind of apply some of what I've learned in one process over here, and I would study another process over here, and I would see how some of that applied, and I would integrate that into this process and this method, this approach that I started calling Holistic Transformation, because that, and this was many years ago when I came up with this idea. So it's about, fundamentally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to transform our lives. We're trying to create transformation. There was a period of time several years back that transformation was a fairly popular term. It hasn't been so much more recently, but that is what we're working with. So we're trying to figure out, how do we change the stuff that we don't want so that we can experience what we do want. That's what we're after here. So, and I like the word holistic because I was studying a lot of holistic principles at the time. So while we're actually talking about the holistic principle, I'm not sure if I may have mentioned the holistic, the phrase that you may have heard of body, mind, and spirit. That is a holistic phrase that kind of expresses something about the makeup of us humans, or the different aspects that combine together to make our experience of being human. And at this point, I'm not sure if I mentioned that what I determined is that there's 4 primary areas that are important. There is, in addition to our physical, the body, of course, is just one. But the other areas that are very much involved in how we have our experience of life. So there's the area of the emotions, the feelings, that would be part of it. And then there's the area of the mind, the mental aspect, and the other is the spirit, which involves, I eventually began to associate the qualities that were involved with spirit as being our beliefs. So we're going to find, as we begin to work through this, we're going to be finding that these things that come up in our life that we don't like are composed of these 3 elements. They are composed of feelings or emotions, and they're as one aspect. Another aspect is our thought patterns. And the other aspect is about the beliefs, the things that we chose to accept as what is truth. And ultimately what we're going to find is all of this was taking place during that period in childhood that I was talking about, where we're looking around us in our environment, and we're trying to determine what is going on in life and what's happening, or what is this world that we're in, what's going on, who are we, what does it mean about myself, how do I fit into the world, what do I have to do to be able to get along in the world, and all of these various things that we were trying to sort out as a child up to the age of about 6 years old. And as these things were going on, as we're having experiences, we draw conclusions about things. And actually, let's back up just for a second. This is a little further into it than I was planning to get into, but there we are. So let's go. So let's say that as a child, there was an experience of some kind. So then there's a response to that. The child has a reaction, a response to this event, this thing, this event that occurs, and there's feelings that are involved. And then there is the thoughts that the child has that are associated with it. These are the thought patterns. So these would be how we interpret the event that occurred. It's kind of like, what does it mean? And then we move into a process then of what is the conclusion that we come to of this? What did we decide that it means? What did we accept as what is true? That becomes the belief. Now, when these 3 aspects, the emotions, the thoughts, and the beliefs that are the result of this experience that the child has, it all gets sort of stuck together, okay? And then it gets stuck in the inner workings of how our life operates, okay? So I don't want to get into that explanation right now, but we can say that it then becomes part of the subconscious. And we'll get into a little more detail a little later on about what that's all about. But the main thing is to get is that for the child that has this experience, especially if there are feelings involved that are like there's an upset of some kind that's involved with this, and then there's perceptions, these thoughts that happen that are like interpretations of what the child thinks that this is of what's going on. And they form views and perceptions and opinions about themselves, because that's what this process is about. Is it's kind of figuring out who am I, and what does this mean about who I am. And those things get, we'll say, recorded by the subconscious. Now, if there's an upset involved and there's a lot of negative energies, these things tend to get more stuck. So they get stuck in what I call our personal energy field. So this is a metaphysical principle that has to do with that we have an energy field around us that's also part of who we are as humans, that we're not just a physical body, we have a field of energy around us. And a lot of what goes on in our life is directly related to this field of energy that's going on. And there's a very extensive, it's a very extensive system. And in a way, it's a little bit like a car. And a car is a vehicle. And the car has a lot of different systems that do different things. So, like on your car, you have the brake system, you have the ignition system, you have the exhaust system, you have the electrical system, you have I think maybe you said the ignition system, you have the combustion system within the engine, and then you have various systems within the engine itself that makes the engine work. So that can roughly be associated with our vehicle that we have here in this world, that we tend to think of as this body. But there's much more involved, okay? So on a more subtle level, we have the ability to have consciousness. So it's like, what does that mean? So the ability to have consciousness is what this is all about, okay? But there are processes, there are systems that we have that makes all of this work, okay? And in a way, there's a system that's kind of like a system on a computer system. So on a computer system, you have the operating system, and it manages all of the things that go on in the computer. And I'm running long on this recording, so I did have something in mind that I was going to talk about what are the type of what are these unwanted patterns that we talked about. But I seem to have followed into this train of thought, so I guess we're going to go with that. So I guess I've gone back to how do we get these patterns that we call them the unwanted patterns? How do those happen? And it happens in childhood. And I got a little more involved in explaining, in going into that explanation than I really intended to. But so where was I? So we have this system called subconscious that is very much like the operating system on a computer. And when we have these events during this period of time during early childhood, that is somewhat like the configuration period on the computer or on a video game, for example, where in a video game you're choosing the things that you want your character to be able to have. This is what's happening during the first few years of childhood. So as we have an experience, we draw these conclusions about what our view, what our opinion, what are the conclusions that we come to about it. That is what gets recorded by this system, by the operating system. Now, if there are negative energies that are involved, or negative emotions particularly, they're kind of, we could say they're sort of sticky, right? So these negative emotions tend to get stuck in this energy field that I'm referring to, which we can think of as being like this, like a bubble around us that is a field of energies, okay? And this thing with this negative thing has just gotten kind of stuck here in your energy field. And what it does is it's stuck there and it's sending out like a broadcast signal of whatever those emotions were that was experienced during that original event. So if I've got angry feelings, if I have fear, if I am mad at someone, like I said, anger is a big one, or if I'm feeling like I have been wronged or mistreated, okay? So that is the quality of the energy that's in that thing, okay? And it's sending that out from our energy field, and it's going out into the world around us, okay? Now, that goes into a lot more advanced principles of what's going on with that, but we can also look at it that what that also is doing as far as our immediate experience of our life is we are experiencing those same feelings. So as we go through life from time to time, we have different experiences, something gets triggered, and that thing gets triggered off, and there it is. And we experience all of those same feelings all over again. It's a lot like, if you remember, we talked a little bit about tapes. So they used to have tapes that would get a repeat loop tape. And this thing that we're talking about, these patterns, I call them, we can also think of them as programs if we're thinking in terms of something like a computer, right? So this tape, this program, this tape, recording, however you want to call it, gets triggered off, and this loop goes off, and it plays that same tape over again. And this happens from time to time down through the years. By the time we become an adult, we've experienced however many different types of occasions to where this thing has gotten triggered, and there it is. Boom. Now, the effect that this has can look like a lot of different things. For some people, people get triggered. We used to call it, you got your buttons pushed. And it might look like someone is fine 1 minute and something happens, somebody says something or some kind of situation, and boom, they just blow up, right? They just lose it, and start ranting or whatever it is that they do, okay? Or someone does. Now, maybe you may relate to that, of having these occasional sort of irrational type reactions to things, and you go afterward, it's kind of like, where did that come from, right? Or what was that about? And then some people may say, well, okay, well, so how do I control that? Well, the problem is you can't unless you do something to address the cause of it. So that's the nature of this work. And that's kind of the point that I like to make is, so there's a lot of things out there as far as advice goes that is recommended of, oh, well, you can do this, you just got to learn how to control your emotions, or you change the way your emotions react to it, or you create an associated memory of some kind to change the memory so that when it gets triggered, then you can have a different response to it. In my experience, that stuff is not what I would call effective. And we can get into more of that later, but basically you're just trying to change something after it's already started, right? Okay, so I'm trying to build up to a little bit of, I wanted to get into talking about like what these patterns or these programs or these unwanted things are, what they look like. Okay, so we've actually maybe this is a good time. All right, so I've got some notes here of just a lot of different types of things that the way these things can show up, because they can look like we talked at one point. I tried to describe about the cassette tape, right? So the cassette tape, or whether it's a CD, which is still like becoming old technology now, so sorry, but a recording of something. So the mechanics of how it's recorded and how it plays back is going to be basically the same. So the material that's recorded onto it, though, can be infinitely variable. We're going to find that these patterns that I call them structures, I also call them, or we can call them subconscious programs. They can show up looking like all kinds of different things. So I've got just a few things. These are in no order. I haven't prepared these notes, so bear with me a little bit. So let's, for example, things like insecurities, okay, phobias, anxieties. We can consider things like some people will have this inner, what they call this inner voice that's critical or judgmental. We call those, or I call them, old tapes. And they can sound like the voice of the parents in our head that are criticizing us. Those will also generate a sense or add to something like self-judgment, self-criticism. So this would be things like what's also called self-talk. So these are things like the things that you say to yourself inside. If they're judgmental, negative in nature, they're self-limiting, things like, oh, well, you're never going to amount to anything, is what's going on inside the head. You're never going to be able to do anything worthwhile. You're never going to be, you're never going to be worth anything. Let's see. So, irrational reactions. That's one of the things I just mentioned. So this can be situations, circumstances, things that people say, things that come up in life that, like I said, all of a sudden we're going along, everything is just fine, and all of a sudden there's just kind of like something happens, and it's almost like boom, insanity happens. Okay, those are like the triggers, the buttons being pushed that we talked about, and those can look like a whole lot of different things. So then we've got things like depression, anxiety, stress. We talked about volatile reactions already. Okay, here we go. Self-esteem. So low self-esteem is fairly common, and it can be based in many different types of things. So it can be like, what do I look like? I think I'm ugly. So for example, some people will have a belief going on inside that they are ugly, and when they are in fact are not. And so, but that person, even though many people around them can tell them that, you're a beautiful person, they won't believe it. And this can also go along the lines of being, someone can be anorexic and have a condition of being too thin, but they always have this impression that they're fat or overweight. And then there's many other forms of self-esteem, like not being good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not loved. And the next thing I said was sense of not worthy or sense of don't deserve. And then we have another thing of not accepted. I'm getting in a hurry because I'm running out of time. I've only got a minute or two left here. So these can come out of conditions where maybe there was a family environment that was perhaps dysfunctional or unhealthy. There can be a background of emotional or mental abuse or neglect. Let's see. So some of the other words that go along with this are things like cognitive dissonance is a fancy psychological term that actually is describing the things that it is that we're talking about here. So these obsessive, compulsive, or they're a victim mentality of feeling like that everything happens to me, that I'm being abused, or whether it may or may not actually be so. It very well may be so. But this sense of that the world is out to get me, the world is being bad to me, those come from these things. So, fear of failure or fear of success, self-limiting beliefs, self-limiting behaviors, self-defeating behaviors, self-defeating beliefs. These are just a few of the things that I call unwanted patterns. And these are the things that we want to learn how to do something about, because basically we can make these things disappear if we apply the principles of knowing and understanding how these things work, where they come from, what causes them to be the way they are, how our system as humans functions, and how we can apply some of these principles to go in and actually remove the causes of where these things come from and what caused them to be showing up in our life, kind of like erasing that tape that we're talking about. Or we can think of it kind of like removing a program from the computer that's flawed in some way or has a virus in it, or for whatever reason it doesn't function right, it doesn't produce results that we would like. So we can do something similar to this. I'm not saying that we're computers, but there's a lot about how we operate that's very similar in nature. And so we can do some things that are very similar, that we can actually go into our operating system, identify what's causing something to happen that we don't want, a bad program, and we can actually remove or delete that program so that it's not producing those effects in our life anymore. Okay? When we do this, life is different.